So our first two speakers actually come from the Cambridge, Kitchener, Waterloo, and area communities. And I'm going to be bringing to the podium Ruth Cameron and Jenn Boyd. Ruth Cameron is the executive director of the AIDS Committee of ACWA. And she's also a PhD student at Laurier University in my field of study, community psychology, so we had a chance to talk about that. And in her doctoral work, she actually looks at intersectoral and intersectional frameworks in order to try and improve outcomes for some of the most marginalized communities that they work with or that she's working with. Jenn Boyd is the harm reduction coordinator for the AIDS Committee of ACWA, and I'm going to invite them both to come to the podium. Thank you.
So I would just like to thank you for having us here today. We're very pleased to be able to discuss our context for service delivery using a gender lens that always engages intersectionality. Now, let me figure out this clicker here. Because of this, we want to start out by describing our context for service delivery at ACWA. It is, from the outset, I want to point out that it is shaped and framed by understanding the importance and the impact of the Canadian war on drugs, colonization of Indigenous peoples on this part of Turtle Island, and the impact of the Canadian context when it comes to anti-Black racism in terms of our service delivery. Noticing the focus on opioid prescribing that was already mentioned, something that we're observing in our work is the impact of changes in opioid prescribing on the communities that we serve. Despite recommendations for humane tapering of prescription doses, to wean individuals off of opioids, we're seeing the effects of individuals abruptly losing access to prescription drugs and moving to the street in absence of a safe alternative. We also know that Black and Indigenous folks have had less access to prescription pain management in the first place due to myths about differential pain tolerance, stereotypes about drug-seeking behavior, and lower health care access due to a colonial racist healthcare system. So just to tell you a little bit about ACWA. It is the AIDS Committee of Cambridge, Kitchener, Waterloo, and area. HIV/AIDS organizations, also known as ASOs, compete to have the longest name. And we have for over 30 years. At ACWA, we are supporting individuals across two sublins of the Wellington-Waterloo LIN, and we have offices in each of the Tri-Cities in Waterloo region. ACWA's been doing harm reduction programming for 23 years, and we haven't had operational funding to do that harm reduction work until around 2 weeks ago. So we've been doing that out of fundraised dollars. Thank you. We're very pleased to be operationally funded under the new expansion that's happened under the opioid strategy. It's really important, vital work. I think it says something in terms of the importance placed on the work that there are communities where people were doing this out of fundraised dollars, keeping people in their communities alive. We have offices, as I said, in each of the Tri-Cities, and we have harm reduction sites, 2 of them located in Kitchener, and a third, which is a satellite office, located in the city of Cambridge. Unfortunately, the site that we have in Cambridge, we haven't been able to staff on a full-time basis due to the resource issues that were noted, but we're very pleased that we'll be moving to that very shortly, having more of a full-time presence there. I'm going to switch gears a little bit now. So I have a question for you, and I'm not expecting someone to actually answer it from the audience, but just to hold on to it when we get to the Q&A portion. So who can tell me a story about the origin of the concept or the framework known as intersectionality? Anybody has heard stories about that origin story? Just show of hands. Okay, great. I just wanted to know that. So, as I had mentioned before, we try to approach our work from an intersectional lens. And this is important for discussing gender in a meaningful way alongside harm reduction. So this concept, intersectionality, I want to ask you one other question. How old do you think it is? So first off, I'm going to put out 30 years old, this concept. What do you think? I'm going to go all over the place here. What do you think? Okay, so no one takes 30. 166, the reason I said 30 is because Kimberly Crenshaw, who's been named as the person who coined the term, is thought of as the originator of it often. Next, I'm going to put out 166 years old. What do you think of that as an idea? Okay, I saw a few hands flash up kind of quickly. And the reason I mentioned that is because of Sojourner Truth, a woman who was formerly enslaved, and her Ain't I a Woman speech, which she posed that question to a convention of white feminists in 1851. Okay, and next I'm going to throw out two numbers, 525 or 562 years old. Anyone? Any takers? Everybody's being a little anxious about it. So the reason I picked those two numbers is because of 525 years ago is when Columbus bumped into what is now known as the Bahamas. Also 562 years old is when the Portuguese set up the trading post that started the transatlantic slave trade to the Americas. So that's the reason I mentioned those two numbers. For me, I think of intersectionality as being somewhere in the neighborhood of 525 to 562 years old, because that is when gender, class, and race relations changed fundamentally for the individuals who are most marginalized when we are doing harm reduction work. So what we know and what we frame as gender in terms of femininity, what we think of in terms of social class, poverty, socioeconomic class, and that is when Indian in the North American context and Black in the Pan-African context first began to be framed. We were not Black before that form of contact. Indigenous people on Turtle Island were not Indian before that form of contact. I say that because of these social relations are an important part of how we think about proceeding when we go on doing our harm reduction work. So we have to think about the impact of colonization when we're doing our harm reduction work, and we have to think about the impact of anti-Black racism for Black women. We have to think about the differential primary health care access, access to addictions and mental health care that women experience based on class and gender, and how we go about creating services for women who are pregnant, women who are mothers, women who are engaged in sex work, women who are second on the needle after their partner or their pimp, and how we go about doing harm reduction for women who do not know how to safely self-inject because of gender biases and gender power differentials. To talk about a category of women as being universal means that we're ignoring women who are most in need of harm reduction. Okay? So we have to think about women who are poor, homeless, fleeing violence, and as I mentioned, disproportionately impacted by colonization. So now I'm going to turn it over to Jenn to speak a little bit about harm reduction out of our Cambridge office.
Thank you. So what we found in Cambridge here, do you want help? Okay. So at Aqua's main office, we tend to see the typical 70-30 gender split between predominantly white men and women, 70% of those being white men accessing our services. But when we looked at Cambridge, we saw a 50-50 split. Now, originally, this is what we're calling the happy accident because it had a lot to do with deficits in service provision as it exists in Cambridge. And previous people in my position really didn't think much of it, or maybe they didn't notice. But I took a look at kind of our stats, and I broke them down between what we were seeing at our other sites versus what we were seeing in Cambridge. And the difference is the Cambridge location it exists inside of a food bank. So I took a look, and that's when I started to see what I was already kind of feeling, that there was something else happening in Cambridge. And we do indeed have a consistent 50-50 split between men and women accessing that service. And we can say it as simply, it's more complex than this, but we can say who is the one that is seeking services, who is the one responsible for food security. Oftentimes it tends to be moms or the women involved in relationships. So in noting that there was a 50-50 split, I began staffing it 50-50 in terms of having enough peer volunteers and staff workers. I also engage with our Women's Community Health Development Coordinator to staff it for an entire day, just to make sure that we were able to have those comprehensive conversations. Because what we see in kind of our low threshold outreach and motivational interviewing conversations is that they happen to be qualitatively different than what we'll see at the other needle exchange sites. The conversations tend to be more about how to use safely. They tend to be more about wound care, and we get a great deal more of sharing around the more harmful aspects of some of the interpersonal relationships that we'll see. These are issues that women have in the drug-using community that differ from men, and we are now better able to access these complexities because we took that gendered lens. The gendered expectations do not shift in the drug-using community. If anything, they're amplified, which is why women-tailored services are absolutely critical. So something else to think about is who is in the gap. It is clear that typical needle exchange programs seem to function rather well in terms of accessing men's needs with that 70-30 split that I mentioned. But when you look closely at women, these gaps become quite a bit more apparent. Though we would love to support groups focused on different constellations of need for the communities most impacted by drug use and opioids, due to the resource issues, we've really only been able to focus on what happens at our needle exchange sites as people access services. So more of an interaction to interaction basis. In addition to the points on the last slide that I mentioned, we do focus more in Cambridge on giving out safer sex supplies, a lot more educational resources that are quite specific to how to inject safely and what that might look like for folks. We make a better attempt at self-care items like pads and tampons to further support what we know are women accessing this kind of service hub. We have also considered, but we haven't yet piloted, black and red condom programs for women who use, for women to use when they're on their periods as they're engaging in sex work. The program has a limited ability to do mobile deliveries. Quite frankly, it's just me. But what I have noticed in those deliveries is that every delivery that I have done, with the exception of one, is to women. I think that this has to do with the barriers of the fixed sites. I think for complex reasons around stigma and childcare and social expectations really speak to the barriers that women are facing in accessing these programs. I think the points on the slide that you kind of see in quotations here are statements that may be your cue to realizing that you have had a moment of intersectional recognition, a way to flag what you want to change in your program's response to the people that you serve, as these are often the response that you kind of hear from, you know, maybe it be funders or upper management. They tend to really talk about, well, their scope, or those are hidden populations that we can't access. And when you start to see those barriers in conversation, that's where this intersectional recognition has come in, where you have identified the characteristics of your programming, if properly developed and further explored, could be absolutely transformational. So something to think about when we talk about our programming is, how do you approach conversations with pregnant or mothering clients so that you do not become the conduit to child apprehension? These are really important things to consider, and they do create barriers for women that leads them to shy away from these life-altering services.
I'm not going to focus on this slide here too much, but we have to think about the interaction of racism, poverty, and sexism, and how that looks in women's everyday lives in harm reduction. I won't go through every point here. I think that these will be mentioned by many individuals, but we have to think about how to support women who may be using transactional relationships for survival, exchanging sex for drugs that they need to prevent sickness, or to use sex to maintain housing. In our context, we have to think about the fact that women are more likely to progress through methods of using, from swallowing and snorting to smoking to injecting, more quickly than men. I think some more important points to mention are when it comes to designing our programs, how we bring that into our practice. Jenn and I are involved in 5 different groups in the region focused on harm reduction, so at regional tables. We have been the individuals, both of us, who are bringing up the fact that our programs have not been designed from the outset with the needs of racialized communities and Indigenous communities at the center. We continue to be those voices at the table. We have to think about in our work how we go about making things more accessible. Jenn has mentioned her great collaborations with our Women's Community Development Coordinator in terms of trying to make programs more accessible. In our program, things, as mentioned by Jenn, have been very much about the needle syringe program interaction. Now that we have operational funding, we have a unique opportunity to build more responsive and representative systems from the ground up. We can now think about engaging more peer workers with a broad range of lived experiences in our program. And in this work, we hope to enhance the ability to reach other women who cannot access our existing programs the way they're currently structured. So thank you.